My name is Todd Terrazas, and I'm the founder and executive director of the AI Light community. We're a nonprofit here in Los Angeles. Think of us like a think tank focusing on how artificial intelligence and frontier tech impact society and different industries. Today, we have a special event on AI ethics in the age of COVID. And so we have our good friend and AI advisor, Arturo Perez, who will be leading this discussion. For housekeeping rules, keep your mic and your video off right now. We will be doing question and answer, you'll be able to ask questions after each speaker's talk. And so if you have a question, please just put it in the chat, and then we will select your questions and allow you to address the speaker after this short talk. So without further ado, here's Arturo Perez to lead the way.
Thanks, Todd, and hey, everybody. As Todd said, I'm Arturo, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Kluge. We're a design company here in Los Angeles, so we're all about human-centered design, and I've been passionate about philosophy for all of my life, so very excited to be doing this. And yeah, today we wanted to talk about what does it mean to be a good technologist. So that's the question we posed to our speakers. And just to give you a little bit of background on it, last year we did an event on ethics, and typically when we tackle this issue, we really talk about artificial intelligence and automation and all the existential threats that there is from it, or the problems with technology right now with data bias and all of that. But in light of everything that's happening in the world, we thought for today we wanted to turn inward and look back at philosophy and ethics and try to do a little bit of inner reflection and think about what does it mean for us as technologists, as makers, as designers. What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be a good technologist? And just as a little bit of background here, when it comes to both the people in technology, involved in technology, and the technologies themselves, including in AI ethics, we typically look at three lenses of ethical frameworks. I'm not going to go too in depth, but at a high level, the deontological and utilitarian frameworks tend to be a set of axioms or principles that are universally applicable. So for example, when it comes to deontology, we talk about one of the axioms could be treat everyone the way you want to be treated. So it's a simple axiom. It's got some hard lines. It can be quote unquote objective through the subject, and it's universally applicable. And so when it comes to building algorithms or building AI, these two frameworks in particular are very handy because you're able to build algorithms around them. And when it comes to virtue ethics, which is a little bit more reflective in nature and sort of it's an ever evolving understanding of being virtuous. It's said, it's not so good for technology. So for example, if you put a robot to observe the human, unfortunately, we humans are not too virtuous. So it's hard to find the right virtuous human by which to observe and learn everything from. And so it's not as handy. But I would argue that maybe when it comes to learning to be a better human, virtue ethics is quite nice. And so for the purpose of today, I want to talk a little bit about virtues in light of this and in light of turning into inner reflection. And virtue comes from the Latin word virtutem, and essentially it means moral strength, high character, and excellence. And obviously there's a lot of room for interpretation here, but the part of the goal, or how I at least practice virtue ethics, and it is a daily practice, is one of reflection and action, right? So it's a constant undertaking of what does it take to build moral strength, to have high character, and to be an excellent human being. What does that mean? And Aristotle speaks about virtue in light of finding the golden mean, finding that center. So when it comes to thinking about it being a good technologist, picking your virtue systems, finding the golden mean, and every virtue has an excess where you take that virtue too far, or a deficiency where you don't have enough of that virtue, or you don't practice it enough. So as an example, I want to talk today about hope, the virtue of hope. So we all hope to be a good technologist. I think that's why we're here, right? But if we don't have enough hope, then we come to despair, right? This idea that, oh, maybe I can never be a good technologist, or other people can never be good technologists. And so that's bad, right? It's not having enough hope, therefore not putting in the work, maybe leads to some depression or through some sadness. And so it diminishes your ability to become a better technologist in order to be a good technologist. But on the other end, if you have an excess issue, you might presume that you already are a good technologist, or that everything is already being acted as in good. And so then that could also lead to not putting in enough work because you presume you already are good enough, or there's no more reflection there. So the idea is to in virtue ethics is to find that golden mean, and it's an ongoing practice. I think about it in terms of when you think about meditation and Eastern meditation, you think about it as affirmations. So there are sort of signposts that help you reflect and take you better your journey. Joseph Pieper was a philosopher from the 20th century. He had something really nice to say about hope. I recently read his book on hope and history. And Joseph says, one who hopes, after all, is not one who desires to know something, but is rather one who anticipates some real thing. One who hopes is concerned about being granted something that they regard as good. And that good thing does have to be obtainable, even on the other side of death. I think the key here is that other side of death. I think everything gets a little bit more deeper when it comes to the reality of our death. And so what do we leave behind? And so when you look at that, take that into account, then it's not just about being a good technologist, but understanding that you're being a good technologist even on the other side of death, and that's what you hope for. And so when you think about things like unintended consequences, and when you think about hoping to not have unintended consequences, and you think about death, unintended consequences become a lot more serious because you don't want to leave them behind as you die onto the world. And so it's just ways to think about it and to reflect. And lastly, Pieper talks about hope in light of becoming wise, good, and just. And these are things that are worth to ponder on and to reflect on. And I'm very hopeful today because as I've met these three wonderful speakers, I can see that they're really giving this a lot of thought, and they're doing it from different lenses. So today, Matthew is going to talk to us coming from the lens of teaching philosophy and teaching ethics to students in Santa Clara University, engineering students. And Reed actually taught philosophy for 10 years, but now he has a company very appropriately called Virtue, and he's bringing this knowledge to technology organizations and other organizations. And Arthi actually is practicing this at Microsoft, where she's the head of user research for the ethics and society field of Microsoft. And I'm just stunned about how mature the ethics practice is and what the level of scale at which they're managing it. So I'm very excited to, and I thank you all for being here and for helping us talk about this. And as Todd mentioned, basically each of you will get a chance to speak for 10 minutes. And in the audience, feel free to chat with us. In the meantime, we're gonna field your questions, and each speaker will get 5 minutes of Q&A. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass on the baton to our first speaker, Matthew Gaudet. Please, Matthew, thank you for coming, and go ahead and give us your insight here, your wisdom.
All right. Let me just share my screen now. All right. So good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Earlier this week, I was having a conversation with my dean where I was trying to make the argument that 10 weeks is not enough time to teach virtue ethics. Today, I've been asked to do it in 10 minutes. So needless to say, this is going to be a very brief overview. And if you are doing a very brief overview of virtue ethics, then in my opinion, the very last thing you should be focusing on is actually the virtues. Virtues are important to the system, but they only make sense within the broader framework. Taken out of that framework, they become something more like rules for life, which is not actually what virtues are at all. In fact, I've come to believe that the label virtue ethics to define this third way of doing ethics is actually a little bit of a red herring. If you ask me, it's better called narrative ethics, because that is what distinguishes it from rule-based or consequence-based ethics. It replaces thin codes of moral rules and calculations and consequences with thick narratives or thick narrative lessons that provide moral guidance. In short, virtue or narrative ethics is about telling stories. Stories with heroes who model good character. Stories with a moral. When understood this way, narrative ethics is not so foreign at all. Rather, narrative ethics is a form of ethics as old as humanity itself. Ancient Greek myths, Confucian fables, Christian parables, medieval fairy tales, are all forms of narrative ethics, as are Star Wars, Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the world of Harry Potter. All of these narratives teach us how to be good by offering us the story of a hero, a good person that we are to emulate. These virtuous heroes are aspirational characters, models to which the rest of us should strive. When taken as a moral standard, we are compelled to find ways to be like Odysseus or the Good Samaritan or Captain America in our own lives. I emphasize the word like in that sentence because it's another salient aspect of narrative ethics is that it operates analogically rather than deductively. The journey of Odysseus doesn't teach us how to defeat sirens and cyclopses so much as it compels us to be like Odysseus and persevere in the face of adversity. The parable of the Good Samaritan doesn't compel us only to help people who have been robbed and left on the side of the road, but rather it compels us to be like the Good Samaritan in acting justly and charitably. Which brings us back to the question of what it takes to be a good technologist. Who are our moral exemplars in tech? What are the stories that we tell? And what is the moral that those stories teach? These are questions we don't ask often enough in tech ethics. When we think of tech ethics, we tend to think about the goodness of technology, not the technologist. Consider the approach of Margaret Gould Stewart. She's a VP of design, or product design at Facebook, and one of Silicon Valley's most vocal advocates for better tech ethics. She says, in technology, we spend a lot of time thinking about what we are able to build. That is, what's possible within the limits of our current technology and resources. We also spend time thinking about what we are allowed to build, what's within policy, what's legal. But as an industry, we need to spend just as much time thinking about what we should build, even though we are not required. And in some cases, we should build, even though we are not required to. And in some cases, what we shouldn't build, even though we are technically allowed to. Able, allowed, should. In this triad, she acknowledges the non-ethical constraints of technologies, the able, the rule-based ethical constraints, the allowed, and then she suggests there ought to be another category, the should. This is great, so far as it goes. I, for one, am glad to hear that someone at Facebook is thinking about the consequences of their platform. But if you pay close attention, her definition of should is entirely focused on the technology, and more importantly, the consequences of that technology. Is it simply enough to aim for good technology? Or do we need to focus on the technologists as well? To answer this, let us do a little analogical thinking ourselves. Let's pretend for the moment that this event was not being held on Zoom, but rather, as it has been in the past, it's held in some location in Los Angeles. What would it take for me to get to the event from my home in the Bay Area? Well, first, let's assume I have a car because no one gets anywhere in LA without a car. But okay. But beyond the physical means, what else would I need? Well, I need a destination and an address. I need turn-by-turn directions, or today, a mapping app on my phone. And then at each junction, the mapping app would tell me what turn to make to keep me moving forward towards my destination. If I make the right move, it prepares for the next junction. If I make a mistake, it recognizes the consequences of that mistake and it recalculates my route back to where I'm intending to go. This is the consequentialist aspect of car driving. But what else would I need? Well, I would also need to know the rules of the road. A quick story. When I was in the Navy, one of my billets was on a ship in Japan. And when I returned to the States, I landed at LAX, and my brother-in-law picked me up at the airport. We got in the car, and he asked if I wanted to drive. I said, sure. It'd been a while since I'd driven down the PCH. And so I pulled out of the lot and started driving down the left side of the road. You know, as drivers do in Japan. As it turns out, we drive on the right side of the road here. To do otherwise is breaking the rules. Those rules are important. They keep us safe. They keep all of the parts working in unison. If I decide I want to drive down the left side of the road when everybody else is driving down the right, things break down. This is the deontological aspect of car driving, the rules of the road. So to get to you all in LA, I need a car, a destination and directions, the rules of the road. This is where Stewart, and the rules of the road, the deontological aspect. This is where Stewart stops and virtue ethics picks up, because this isn't enough. To get to LA, I also need skill at driving. Or to complete the metaphor, to get to moral technology, we need to consider the laws and the rules and the consequences of every step we take, but we also need moral skills. the virtues, to actually get us to the destination. And how do we pass on moral skills? Well, by telling stories. Stories with models of character, stories that have a moral. This is all the more true for AI, because here at the leading edge of technology, often the rules haven't been written yet, and the consequences can be very hard to predict. Building good technology in civil engineering is easy because there's a well-established building code, and the outcomes are generally predictable. It's like driving on LA in a freeway. It's familiar, if painful. But good AI during a global pandemic, on the other hand, is like driving through a mountain pass with ice and snow and low visibility. The rules of the road and the turn-by-turn directions haven't changed, but it's the skill of the driver that's going to get you through. In short, rules, rights, and consequences are only as good as the technologist who's wielding them. So what does it take to be a good technologist? More than anything, it takes telling the right stories. I just told you one. The hero is the driver, and the challenge is the storm. But analogically, this parable helps us to see that tech ethics is about developing skills, not just maximizing benefits. Let's try another story. This one's an all too familiar tale. A few years ago, a video made the rounds in which a black man showed that the automatic soap dispenser in his company's bathroom could not recognize the pigment of his skin. In order to get soap out of the dispenser, he needed to put a white paper towel on his hand to get the sensor to register. Or how about a few years back, when Google Photos Google Photos labeling algorithm began identifying pictures of black people as gorillas. And Google had to shut down the label. They actually had to take out the label for gorillas in order to fix the problem. Or just a few months ago, Google again, this time Google Vision, an app for processing video, labeled a hand holding an infrared thermometer, a really important tool these days, as a firearm when the hand was black, but not when it was white. It's easy to say in today's world that racism is a police problem, but clearly the tech sector has its own demons to excise too. One final story, if I can squeeze it in. Yeah, I think I have the time. The City Corp Tower in New York City is one of the most iconic buildings in New York City. I'm from New York, and so every time we drive by the city, you'd look for three buildings that stood out. The unique slanted top of the City Corp building arose up there with the spires of the Empire State and the Chrysler buildings to define the New York skyline. What many people who just pass by the city, though, don't realize is that at the base of the building is just as unique. The skyscraper is actually built on 8-story stilts to accommodate St. Peter's Church, which actually occupies the land underneath one of the corners of the building. You can sort of see it in the far left corner of this picture. Not only that, but because the church, the stilts of the building sit on are actually located at the center of each side of the building instead of the four corners. When the structural engineer that designed the steel skeleton for the building, he built it to transfer all of the forces into these 4 stilts. But when he calculated the wind forces, he made an assumption, as you often do with regular buildings, that the wind forces that we have to calculate for, the strongest wind forces, the greatest stresses on the building would be when the wind came perpendicular to one of the sides of the building, thus pushing the whole building like a sail. This would have been the greatest stresses if the stilts were at the corners. However, because the stilts were where they were, in the middle of each wall, the greatest stresses actually came when wind came 45 degrees off the corners, because this pushed on both sides of the building and there was no opposing stilt to basically push it back. The building was constructed with a faulty design, and wasn't until a few years later that an undergraduate student at Princeton who discovered the error while studying the building for her senior thesis. She raised it to the junior engineer she had gotten the plans from at the design company, and he dismissed her. But nonetheless, he ran up the chain to the senior designer of the building. This senior designer had the humility to recognize that he had made a crucial and potentially catastrophic mistake. The building was repaired just in time to survive a major hurricane. They were literally doing repairs as the hurricane moved up the East Coast. So what does that story have to do with AI? Well, plenty. It's a story about an engineer who embodied the virtue of humility, as this prevented catastrophe. Too often in ethics, we don't start telling the stories about something. We don't start telling stories until something goes catastrophically wrong. I love the story because it offers a counterexample, a heroic engineer whom we should model ourselves after. So, in conclusion, moral narratives can take on many forms. They can be fictional or they can be true. They can be metaphorical or historical. They can have a named hero or an implied one. They can come from within the discipline or from a parallel one. But these stories need to be told, and they need to be repeated, and they need to become part of the corporate culture. Just think, that junior engineer would never have raised the issue up the chain of that corporate culture if that corporate culture wasn't built to allow for that. The only way that junior engineer would know, though, is that if he had heard stories about how the boss takes criticism. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus often begins his parables with the phrase, "The kingdom of heaven is like," and follows with some metaphor, a mustard seed, a vineyard, a shepherd or with a lost sheep. For our purposes, we might say, a good technologist is like a driver in a winter storm, the designer of a racially sensitive soap dispenser, the humble engineer who listened to the undergraduate, and so on and so forth. It's this so on is where I turn the question to you. What stories are you and your peers telling about being a good technologist in the field of AI? What narratives give us guidance when confronted with new challenges at the age of COVID? I'm hoping our next two panelists can offer us many more of these stories, direct from their own works of industry. And I ask you to as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Super great presentation. I love that framing of virtues as narratives. There's a lot to learn there, and it kind of gives us guidance on where to seek. I'm curious, you mentioned some stories related to technology, but just in general, what are some stories that have influenced you in building your own virtuous life?
I like to think in terms of the person we want to become. So, one way to think about when I was a kid, in sort of Christian circles, there was this thing where we used to wear these bracelets that said WWJD. What would Jesus do? And this is a virtue tradition right there. It's asking, what would this virtuous ideal person do in the situation that I'm in? This is the question that we're supposed to ask. I don't always ask what would Jesus do, but oftentimes what I like to ask is, what would my dad do? My father is this virtuous model for me. And I have to ask, what would he do? And oftentimes that really does. He was an engineer for Northrop Grumman for years and years and years, for his whole career, basically. He spent 10 years in the Navy and then got out and went to work for Grumman and spent a whole career with them. What would he do? And it's not so much one story, but it's knowing his character and the entire sort of history of stories that he told me about his kid and his career, about when he was a kid and when he had a career and when he did this and when he did that. He told me one story that I've actually repeated to a number of people, where he actually, when he was a teacher, he taught ROTC at UCLA, and he had to actually fail somebody out of the program. And I've thought of this often when I have students that I have to fail. And how what ended up happening is he failed this person out of the program. They ended up having, in order to pay back what they had paid, they ended up having to enlist in the Navy. And he met up with this guy, 5 or 6 years later, and the guy thanked him for failing him out of the program, because it was the kick in the pants he needed to sort of get his life in order and structure himself and move on it. And he realized in hindsight how great it was. And so, this is the kind of story that when I think about, this person that I have to deal with, this student is not doing as well as they like, as well as I would like them to. Maybe sometimes what they actually need is a kick in the pants more than they need an A in this class, right? And so, I think of stories about my dad and about other people that I look to as moral exemplars in my own career and how I operate. It's been a long time since I was an engineer, so I don't have a good engineering story for you, but there's a good teaching story.
That's fantastic. And, it shows us we can pick stories from our loved ones, as in your case, and how important it is to have models out there, which is great. We have a question from Ishani. In a data-driven world where companies are making decisions based on abundance of data, how can one make a case in a company based on one story to affect change?
I think the data-driven world part of that question is part of the problem, is that if we don't have a corporate culture that's willing to tell stories at all, that everything is going to be driven by the numbers, then we're not going to have any ethics. But I also, on the flip side of that, I think it's impossible to have it a purely data-driven system. How we understand our data is understood through stories. Whether or not we're seeking this metric or that metric, we tell a story about that. My wife is a technologist, working in the music sector, and she comes home all the time and tells me about how the need for her to basically take this data and tell a story about it, and how others don't seem to understand this notion that what needs to happen in order to take data and make it usable is you still have to tell the story. Well, that story can be a moral story. It doesn't have to just be a story about what outcomes you're trying to get. There is morality built into that. So I don't think even in a data-driven world, if we're resigning ourselves to that the world is data-driven, then we're missing half of what we need to be doing anyway. And that's true of any organization, because the way we communicate through organizations is by telling stories. So I don't know if
that's great. I think it helps, and it starts off the conversation. And we have just want to acknowledge Chitro sent some questions. I think this one thing he mentioned to me in private. These are 3 questions that feel free to any of the speakers to tackle. But how to supervise and create trust in AI? Should AI be regulated, and how should it be done? And how algorithms may be used in stealth mode to limit market competition while retaining the appearance of competitive environments. And those are big, broad questions, Matt. But curious, before we take it away to read, if anything comes to mind from them.
Well, I think one of the things I try to teach my students is that not only do individuals have character, but corporations have character. There's companies we trust with our data, and there's companies we don't trust with our data. There's companies that seem to be at least trying to do good, and then there's companies that you kind of want to touch with a 10-foot pole. Keep them at a distance. And I think character within organizations is just like character amongst individuals. It's bred and it's passed down, and it's communicated through stories. But in a world of AI, in a world of data, and a world of interconnectedness, in many ways like we've never had before, we need to be able to trust the virtues of the organizations we're interacting with. And so should AI be regulated? Well, yeah, that would be a rule-based approach, and there are good reasons to put some sort of boundaries on what AI can and can't do, or should and shouldn't do. But I also think there's something to say, do I want my company, my organization, and the organizations I choose to work for to be good organizations? So it broadens this question beyond just what is a good technology, but what is a good technology company? And that's a really important question too. And it's answered in much the same way. So.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. Reed, I'm gonna hand the baton off to you. I think we're not doing a live presentation, so feel free to take it away. There's some questions still lingering. If you can feel free to use them as inspiration, or we'll hear your wisdom and go back to a little Q&A. So thanks for joining us.
I'm actually fresh out of wisdom, so I'm just gonna have to give you stupid sayings. That's what I'm. So thanks, Arturo, for having me, and thanks AI LA for having me. This is the easiest trip to LA I've ever taken, so this is great. So my name is Reed Blackman. I'm a philosopher by training. I left academia after about 20 years and became an ethics consultant about 2 years ago, focusing on emerging technology. when I was a professor and a researcher, I did a tremendous amount of work, almost an embarrassing amount of work on virtue and Aristotle and the like. So you'll have to forgive me if I go a little bit too academic here, because you know, you're talking to my core. So, you know, so look, I should say at the outset, for what it's worth, you know, as Arturo, you pointed out that there are these three main moral theories: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. My own view, frankly, is that none of them should be used when doing AI ethics. I actually think that these theories mostly get in the way for a variety of reasons. Just very quickly, one of them is that there isn't any agreement on which of those three theories is the right one. There's tons of disagreement for literally centuries over whether any of them is the right theory. In fact, some people don't even think that there is a true theory to be had on ethics. So that's one thing to say. And then even if people do agree on which approach or which theory is the true theory, you know, suppose everyone says, right, let's all go in for virtue ethics. It turns out that there are dozens of varieties of virtue ethics. So if you're looking for anything like consensus, then appealing to very abstract theories is not going to be, I don't think, to drive consensus and coming together to think about what should be the actual policies and decisions that we ought to make moving forward to ensure that we don't ethically screw things up massively. Right? So I think we can sort of spot the ethical risks and the ethical problems without having to appeal to a theory. In fact, sometimes theories can warp the judgments that we make, or they can provide false cover for various biases, because, you know, we have our biased conclusion and then we find our theory and then we just work our theory to give us the conclusion that we want. So that's just my very quick warning about a sort of, and I'm not, Arturo, I'm not at all, so I'm not suggesting that Arturo was suggesting that we just sort of simply go from choose your theory and then apply it. But this is sort of my big warning against appealing to those theories. And I say this as someone who has taught those theories for decades. So now the question at hand is about what it is to be a good technologist. I'm going to start my stopwatch because as a philosopher, I tend to prattle on. So I need to rein it in. When you ask the question, what is it to be a good technologist? And then you raise the prospect of virtue theory or virtue ethics, you can't help but think about Aristotle. So here is an absolute total crash course in Aristotle. So when you talk about virtues, they don't just come out of nowhere. So here's Aristotle's view. Look, there are different kinds of things. There are flautists, there are knives, there are doctors, there are human beings. Those are different kinds of things. Some of those kinds of things have a function. So the function of a knife is to cut. The function of a flautist is to play the flute. The function of a doctor is to heal patients. The function of a parent is to care for their children, and so on and so forth. And you get to be a good member of the kind, a good knife, or a good doctor, or a good parent, if you cut well, heal, and care for children successfully, respectively, right? So what is it to be a good member of a given kind? It's to do really well at performing the function of that kind, whether we're talking about an inanimate object like a knife or a social role that a person occupies like a flautist, a doctor, a parent, etc. Now, where do the virtues come in? So in Aristotle's overall view, and this is, I think, really just an accurate conception of what it is to be good of a kind, a virtue is a feature that makes the member a good member of the kind. So like, what are the virtues of a knife? Probably like a sharp blade, it's well balanced, etc. Why are those the virtues of a knife? Because they're the things that actually make it the case that it can carry out its function. Right? The fact that the knife is blue is not a virtue of the knife because it doesn't aid it in carrying out its function. It might be aesthetically appealing. The blueness might be nice, but it doesn't make it a good knife. It might be a good knife that's nice to look at. When you talk about, say, a parent, and you talk about the virtues of a parent, well, it's what makes a parent a good parent. So what are the character traits that make a parent capable of carrying out the function of being a parent, namely taking care of the children? Well, it's going to be things like patience and empathy and compassion and a concern for that their child flourish, and so on and so forth. So what it is to be a virtue is essentially tied to what the function of the thing is. So that's what it is to be a virtue. So when people talk about virtues, at least if you talk about it from something like Aristotle's view, or you're just thinking about what is it to be a good X, the virtues are not just sort of arbitrary character traits that you like a lot. They are things that are conceptually tied to carrying out the function of the kind. Okay, that's the first thing I want to say. Here's the second thing. And there are 17 things I want to say. No, I'm kidding. 3 things I want to say. So when we talk about different kinds of things, some of them are ethically bad, some of them are ethically good, and some of them are ethically neutral. So here are some ethically bad kinds of things a person can be. Assassin, Nazi, terrorist. Those are 3 bad kinds of things. Notice you could be an awesome assassin. Give me a really good assassin, but you're really good at being an ethically bad kind of thing. There are some things that are really ethically good to be. Or let me put that slightly differently. There are some things that have ethical standards built into them. I think parent is a pretty good candidate for that. Citizen is also another plausible candidate for that. So to be a good parent, you have to manifest you have to meet certain kinds of ethical standards. After all, what you're charged with in being a parent is to care for the welfare of another person, and caring for the welfare of another person is essentially an ethical phenomenon. So you've got some ethically bad kinds, like assassin. You've got some ethically good kinds, like parent, possibly citizen. I'm sure there are a few others, at least. And then there are some that are just ethically neutral. They're not ethically bad. They're also not ethically good. So I think something like being a sailor. Yeah, being a sailor is a fine thing. It's, it's not ethically good in itself. It's not ethically bad in itself. It's sort of ethically neutral. So you can be a great sailor, but you're great at being an ethically neutral sort of thing. So now at last we come to talking about technologist. What is it to be a good technologist? And so my question is being a technologist to be a member of an ethically bad kind, an ethically good kind, or an ethically neutral kind? It'd be odd to think that it's ethically ethically bad. There's some, what's wrong with being a technologist? You're just, you're solving problems with various technological solutions. That seems all fine and well. I don't think it's the case, though, that being a technologist is to be a member of a good kind, ethically good kind either. You can be a phenomenal technologist, but what you do is you invent various torture devices. That's not good, right? So, there have surely been absolutely brilliant technologists who have invented in very innovative, creative, user-centric way how to create torture devices, right? The wheel, the rack, and so on and so forth. Very, very user-focused, just focused on the user's pain as opposed to their pleasure. So I don't think it's the case that a technologist, or the kind technologist, is necessarily an ethically good kind of thing to be. So I think it's ethically neutral. Now, you could be a technologist that is ethically good or ethically bad, right? That much is clear. And so I think that a lot of what we're getting at when we ask a question like, what is it to be a good technologist, is we're not asking something like, what are the ethical standards that are internal to being a technologist? I don't think that there are any. I think you're asking something like, hey, we're technologists and we want to be good people, even in our role as technologists, what does that entail about how we should behave as technologists? So, and then you come up with various kinds of, broadly ethical categories that you should manifest in being a technologist. Intellectually humble, to mention, Matt's virtue, one of the virtues that Matt mentioned, inclusive, compassionate, empathetic, concern for justice and fairness, yada, 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 yada. I will say that there's one way of sort of seeing things a little bit differently. I mean, I think that's the right way to see it. But I do think that things could be otherwise. And perhaps it would be best if they were otherwise. So think for a second about the kind doctor, the social role of being a doctor. There are ethical standards built in to being a doctor. If you don't meet certain kinds of ethical standards, you are kicked out of the profession. being a technologist or an AI engineer or an IoT engineer, or however, fine-grained you'd like to cut up these kinds of technologists, as of right now, they are not professionalized in the sense that they don't come along with a set of ethical standards that members must meet on pain of being excommunicated from that social role. That's a decision we could make to do. We could make the decision to build in ethical standards into being a certain kind of technologist. You'd have to be certified in a certain way. If you violate those standards, you can be debarred in the way that lawyers are debarred. And that would be a way of changing the social role of technologist so that it includes certain kinds of ethical standards for even being a member of that role in the first place, being a member of that kind in the first place. I think that would be a pretty fruitful way to go, but I don't think that we're there yet. And so in that sense, if we're talking about being a good technologist, in the sense that by virtue of part and parcel of being a good technologist is that you're also meet some ethical standards, that is going to be a social and political achievement. It's not something that we have right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Reed. Thanks for that. That's excellent. And I'm really curious, before I go into the chat questions, you mentioned early at the beginning of your talk, there was a critique on the theoretical frameworks of ethics. And I'm curious if that thought of yours happened as you transitioned into having a company, or was it something that you already felt as a professor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I felt it as a professor as well, because I've taught very sort of phenomenally abstract ethical courses in ethics, and I've also taught engineering ethics and medical ethics, environmental ethics, and it's sort of known, frankly, by philosophers that you don't do applied ethics well. Applied ethics means taking some thinking about particular concrete ethical problems. You don't do applied ethics well by taking some massive theory and just applying it to the case at hand. And I should say that one of the reasons that those ethical theories were not meant to be decision-making trees. That's not what they were. That's not their essential function. Their function is to explain and predict certain kinds of data, specifically roughly intuitive data about what kinds of acts are right and wrong and permissible and impermissible. They're not meant to be decision guides.
Fair enough. Makes sense.
So for what it's worth, like virtue ethics, deontology, consequentialism, they're all meant to be in the business of explaining roughly the same set of data. Rape is bad, genocide is bad, helping elderly people across the street is good. They all want to explain that data. They just have different ways of doing it. One by an appeal to what constitutes a good character, that's virtue. One by appeal to a set of rules, that's deontology. And one by appeal to the goodness of the consequences brought about by those kinds of actions, that's consequentialism.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And good to know you're consistent throughout. And I have a question here from Annie. So she says, he says, I am curious to hear how you take Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia and pose it to executives at tech companies to get them to think about broader societal impact of their products.
Yeah, great, thanks. So eudaimonia is an ancient Greek term. It's standardly translated as flourishing. Some people will translate it as happiness. One reason it's not translated as happiness is that, at least in our contemporary society, happiness has the connotation of being something subjective. It's a kind of feeling one has or an attitude one has towards one life. That's not in the ancient Greek term. And when Aristotle talks about eudaimonia, it's nice to talk about flourishing because we can think about things that don't even have subjective states as flourishing. Flowers can flourish, but they don't feel anything or have attitudes of any sort. Myself, I don't think that we should be talking about eudaimonia with tech companies. And my reason is sort of straightforwardly practical. Look, getting a tech company, or rather any company at all, to think about human flourishing is a massive lift. It's arguably too great a lift. What I'd rather have them think about first, given that we have there's limited resources, limited time, we can only move companies so much, is to think about human misery and avoiding human misery. If you want companies to, I don't think we should be thinking about what are our highest ideals and can we get tech companies to live up to them. The odds of that are phenomenally slim. You have much better odds at can we stop them from doing major damage. And so that's not about the pursuit of eudaimonia, that's about the avoidance of vice. So maybe I should, I misnamed the name of my company. Oh well.
So based on the approach you describe about, what is the function of a particular role object? So who gets to define what is a good technologist? And there's some examples here. Some would say who programs fastest versus programs more concise code, or versus makes a start of parallel and money making versus has a good social impact. So who gets to define what is a good technologist?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually two questions there. One is who gets to define it, and the other is something like, should we say that this person is a good technologist, or should we say that that person is a good technologist? So I actually want to answer the second question, or the second implication of a question first. Look, there are lots of good teachers out there. Some of them are phenomenally dynamic, inspiring, etc. And that's what makes them good teachers. Some people are good teachers because they are so painstakingly precise that they just do a good job of communicating ideas to people who like to receive information dryly and precisely. That's just to say that there's a variety of ways of being a good teacher. It's not as though there's the good teacher. There's one way of being a good teacher, and that's the end of it. So too with a technologist. I imagine that there are a variety of ways that one can become a good technologist. And put it slightly differently, in the language that Arturo is a fan of right now, there are a variety of virtues that technologists can manifest that make them good technologists. And it's quite plausible that while there is a set of sufficient virtues such that the technologist is a good one, it might be the case that there's no necessary one. It might be that there's not like one virtue that every technologist has to have. There's different virtues to be had, and different kinds of virtues can make different kinds of good technologists. Some are good technologists by virtue of how creative and imaginative they are, and some by how phenomenally precise they are in their coding, right? Those are different ways of getting to be a good technologist. Okay, that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say about, am I talking a lot with my hands? I do that. Is it weird on video? Anyway.
Hands work.
I can't not talk with my hands. What would I do with them? So the other thing, who's to say? I am generally of the view that that's the wrong question. Not that it's a good question to ask. I think it's the wrong question in that it has a false assumption. And the false assumption is that there is some particular person or set of people who have the authority to make something good or to create the standards, and then they do. I think the question is better posed as what makes it the case that someone is a good technologist? What reason or evidence do we have for believing that that's what makes the technologist a good one? And then there are various arguments that one can give. Right, so when we said something like, a marriage can be between a man and a woman, and others pushed back, two men or two women, and people pushed back and said, no, by definition, it's between one man and one woman. We didn't go around looking for the writers of the Oxford Dictionary, right, to find out, oh, well, Oxford is the authority on definitions, so let's just go ask them what the definition is and we'll be settled. Right? That's not how you go about doing that. Instead, what people did was they offered arguments about what constitutes a good marriage. Look, a good marriage is one that obtains between two people who love each other and thereby care for each other's welfare, well-being, happiness, flourishing, eudaimonia, whatever you like. And once you sort of argue and tease that out as the central feature of a good marriage, it doesn't matter the sex of the person. It turns out that it's irrelevant. And then most people were convinced of that, I think. And so now we thankfully have gay marriage. But it wasn't an argument over semantics, over the definition of a term. It was an argument about what's the best substantive conception we can have about what constitutes a good marriage. And a certain side rightfully won that debate, and then we had the political outcomes that we did. So it's not how do we, who gets to define it. It's what's the best conception of what constitutes a technologist or a good technologist. Let's argue about that. And perhaps it entails meeting certain kinds of ethical standards, and then we can build certain kinds of professional standards around that, including bodies to enforce those kinds of things.
Reed, thank you so much for your insight. I totally see the academic training behind everything you say, which is great.
Are you saying
great
I'm boring?
use.
You're saying I'm boring?
No, I think it's important. It's important to have qualifications and nuance. I'm personally very happy with that.
Thanks.
I'm going to pass it on. We're running short on time here, and we have one more speaker. And Arthi, please take it away and teach us some of that wisdom that you're doing over at Microsoft. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you so much first, Arturo and Todd. Thanks for the invitation. And looks like quite a lot of people have shown up today. So thanks for attending as well. All right, so let's get into it. Just some quick intros. Maybe I can go really quick on this. I mean, if you think about it, in the last 30 years, we've been spending a lot of time trying to teach people how to use computers, right? But if you look at it today, we're spending a lot of time teaching computers how to understand people and the world around them. So we can call this as a fourth industrial revolution, which is really transforming the way we live our lives. And emerging tech is really, really transforming any industry that you can imagine, be it healthcare or industrial safety applications or robotics, you name it. This is Seeing AI. It's an app. It's actually the #1 app used by the blind community. Some phenomenal benefits of this, right? Because it's powered by machine learning. It helps the blind users navigate the world around them. HoloLens. This is a depiction which basically shows that right in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, Philips China was using the system to train frontline workers in hospitals on their new CT scanner. So my point being that there are some tremendous great applications of technology. However, everything is not flowery, right? I mean, we are no longer looking at technology in a blind sort of a utopian view. I mean, the debate on the dystopian side is equally real. I mean, you see all of this in the news today, which is what's corporate accountability and, addiction maximizers, attention hijacking, and autonomous weapons and privacy and surveillance capitalism, go on and on and on. So, and just in the last year, we have seen some interesting things happened. Just look at synthetic speech space. In the last year, so if folks are not familiar with synthetic speech, the whole idea is you can basically just take snippets of somebody's voice. And today you only need 500 to 1,000 utterances of somebody's voice, and not even in a controlled lab setting. And you can convert that into a voice font, which can then essentially say things that you never said. And last year it was used to scam a CEO of quite a bit of money just by using this voice deepfake. I love this book called Army of None. Here the author really talks about some basic questions like what happens when a predator drone has as much autonomy as a Google car, or when a weapon that can hunt its own targets is hacked, or what if weapons can attack targets without human input? I mean, none of this is sci-fi today. So I think one of the speakers earlier talked about sort of racial stereotypes that creep into some of our machine learning models. Here, what's being illustrated is a computer algorithm essentially predicts that the African-American lady was assigned a higher risk score than the white man. And fast forward 2 years later, the woman has not committed any crimes and the guy is imprisoned. The white guy is imprisoned. So what's happening here is stereotyping harm, which is basically what happens when your systems, AI systems, they don't magically make decisions, right? So they're reinforcing your existing sort of societal stereotypes. And basically, they may have used some sort of proxy variables to race, such as employment records or parents' past criminal records. I mean, it could be a variety of things that crept into this sort of stereotyping harm in this machine learning model. So my point here is that we are designing societally complex systems. So you can't just say that, hey, I'm just introducing a piece of technology. I mean, that's all I do. I write a piece of code. No, that's not enough. We are designing extremely complex systems. So it's super important that we ask questions, such as, What concerns will stakeholders have about the data that's being collected about them? Are certain individuals or groups being excluded from being able to use the device? What are some of the unintended consequences of the device? What can perpetuate these unwanted biases and stereotypes? Are the users of the system able to understand how the product makes decisions? Where do people using the system go if it does not perform the way they anticipate or intend? So I love this quote from our president, Brad Smith. When your technology changes the world, you bear a responsibility to help address the world that you have helped create. So with that, what is that responsibility? What does responsible innovation, aka ethics in an applied setting, mean? So I'm in the Ethics and Society team within Microsoft's Cloud and Artificial Intelligence division. And this is how we view of ethics. So we think of it in 5 sort of layers, starting with reflexivity. So what reflexivity means is that, you know, at the end of the day, it's humans who are creating these systems, right? And all of us have our own biases. We make our own assumptions. We have our own motivations. And reflexivity is just examining your assumptions and examining our moral character. So what we do internally at Microsoft is we do a lot of sessions with our senior leaders as well as different engineering teams to make ethics a part. We do a lot of workshops to ensure that ethics is a part of the product development process. It's a part of our reward structure. So, so there is incentives in various ways for people to include this and to embed it as part of product development. We also do a lot of development of internal training programs to teach people how to essentially fish, how to apply ethics to their day-to-day jobs. The next is inclusivity. And by that, what I mean is really bringing the perspectives of diverse set of individuals who are impacted by the technology that we are building, which may also include people who may object to some of our work. Like for instance, next month, I have a meeting with some human rights organizations to discuss technology that we are working on to see what are the blind spots that we may have. The next is anticipation. It is really trying to be structured and thinking through what could be the unintended consequences of the technology that you're building. So if there are any engineers in the room, you know, you may be familiar with like the threat modeling that security discipline uses. So similar to that, we have developed something called a harms modeling. And what we do through that exercise is systematically think about things like laws of opportunity or laws of dignity, laws of liberty, psychological stress, all of these things that can happen to the stakeholders who are impacted by the tech we are building. And the last is really intentionality. I think some of my co-speakers today touched on that, which is really taking a step back and being principled in and intentional in product development. So what does that mean, right? So luckily for us, we have a set of guidelines that has been created that we use a lot in thinking through what could be the ethical dilemmas that can happen when we engage on a certain product. So our core ethical principles include privacy and security, fairness, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. And of course, depending on the product that you're building, there are a lot more things that may be prevalent. So I like to focus on inclusivity. I don't know how many UXers are in the room today, but I'm a user researcher. My job is to work with end users and other stakeholders who are impacted by the technology that we are building. So really, my role is to work with the humans, right? My role is really to bring their perspectives and highlight that to the product makers. So, and what is it that I would suggest is, one of the unique things that we do is we think a lot beyond just the mainstream sort of stakeholders. You know, most large organizations that have fully funded research and design teams do think of their end users. But what we do is we take that a little step further to think about including the perspectives of traditionally marginalized or disempowered communities like LGBTQ community. We have worked with racial minorities. Women could be a vulnerable population depending on certain technology that we are building. Introverts, so personality differences are also important. Individuals with physical and other speech, vision, and other mobility sort of impairments. So think about your diverse population when trying to design technology. Now, of course, I can go on and on and on about ethics because we are quite a multidisciplinary team, and that's our approach to ethics. But I would love to end with like 3 things, especially for the user researchers, if there are any in the room, or generally the UXers, user research and design disciplines. One is, as you do your work and as you develop technology, broaden your definition of end users. So don't stick to your, okay, you're working on an enterprise product. Don't just recruit, employees from your own organization, right? Think about diversity. Have you considered people with different privacy consciousness in your work? What about balancing across gender identity? What about different age groups? What about bringing perspectives of people from different ancestries, and so on and so forth? Also think about your indirect stakeholders. So don't focus just on your end users, but there could be people who are impacted by your technology who are not the users necessarily of the system. Like for instance, right now we are designing building access using facial recognition technology, and we are working with security officers and receptionists who are indirectly impacted by this technology. They are not the end users necessarily, but they are impacted. Their work is impacted. Their day-to-day responsibilities impacted. So how do we bring their perspectives in to create a better user experience, to create an ethical product? And lastly, I would say, try to uncover your blind spots, because we all do, right? And especially more and more large tech companies are investing in a lot of complex sort of domains. Like for instance, Microsoft, we work on certain military products, and that's a very complex domain. So how do you uncover your blind spots? Try to solicit the opinions of experts who have sort of years of experience and expertise working in these complex domains to help you along your product development journey. I know I'm out of time, so I'm gonna stop here. I'm happy to take questions.
Arthi, thank you. And I see Carol Rosie, she mentions, yes, we're here. And I know Carol, she's head of user research at NerdWallet. So just some signaling that there's quite a few, I see a few familiar faces in the UX community. So you got your colleagues here. And one thing, Arthi, that really impressed me when talking with you is also the parity at which your department has with product, right? So in a sense, you're very embedded into the product development process, and a lot of the things you're seeing are things that you're flagging and they're actually taking seriously and implementing. So that's amazing as well. Awesome. So we have some questions. So can you please explain more, this is from Chitro, on how the complex system looks like and how you interpret the machine embedded decision process?
How a complex system looks like. I mean, it's very contextual. Your question is quite contextual. So complexity can take any number of forms, right? So it could be a complex domain that you're deploying the system in. Like I said, this is a public knowledge, like a HoloLens that is going to be used in a military setting. So you think of mixed reality that's being used in a military setting. That's an extremely complex domain, right? Because if something goes wrong, there are hazardous consequences because it's being used in combat. But anything really, so to answer your question, one of the first things that we do as a team when we take on a big engagement is we do something called a harms exercise. And this is a practice or a best practice that we have launched publicly as well. So I'm happy to share that with you, Arturo, and if you're able to share it with the folks. We are always taking inputs on how we can improve our technique. But essentially with that technique, what we try to do is we try to systematically think through what can go wrong. So that will help us identify complexity in that domain, right? So that's like one of the initial things that we do. And then we sit with product teams and iterate and understand. And some of the main themes, what I have seen in my tenure are things like, how do we keep the human operator in the decision-making loop, when you design complex systems? How do you determine the right kind of data that's needed for training machine learning models? How do we ensure fairness in designing systems? How do we make sure that the product works for different types of individuals and don't exclude a particular group? So I don't know whether I answered your question, but complexity is a complex thing.
For how broad the question is, I think you've done very well. I got a question here from another fellow designer, Evren, and she asks, how do you uncover blind spots of your teams? Do you measure biases of your team who's building for inclusiveness?
Yeah, so what we do is we embed very closely with different product teams, and we work closely with them. So luckily for us, we have a great set of principles. So that Microsoft 6 ethical principles that I talked to earlier. So we use that and make sure that, okay, so privacy, what does it mean to protect privacy of the user in this context? So what does that mean, right? So are we being transparent with the user in terms of what data is being collected? Who is going to have access to their data? How long is that data being used for? What will that data be used for? So we really try to embed with product teams to understand the space, and we use some of the frameworks that we have internally to help uncover our blind spots. We also make sure that for all our major engagements, we directly engage with the end users and stakeholders. Just for the facial recognition using building access that I was referring to, we worked with people who access buildings, but also people from different racial minorities, knowing that face recognition systems work differently for people of color. We worked with individuals with physical disabilities and visual impairments for that particular project. So again, back to your question, because I can go on and on, is embedding with product teams, using Harm's framework to really nail down on what can go wrong and who are the impacted stakeholders and what could be the unintended consequences that we should be minimizing. And then really taking on a human-centered design approach. And consulting with external organizations like human rights groups or other experts as needed. Like for instance, we are working with a lady who helped develop some of the AI principles for the Pentagon on a project. So consulting with the external experts to advise us as well. So it's a multi-faceted approach.
I love it. And I was mentioning earlier in our conversations, Arthi, how you are very lucky and you're able to look at this broader set of considerations. And there's some of us still in the user experience field who are still fighting that our executives let us talk to the user. But really to think ethically and to really do this right, we have to consider such a full and rich set of considerations. So I appreciate what you're doing, and that you're able to do it is phenomenal as well. So I have one last question. There's lots of questions here, which I'm also very grateful to the group by, and hopefully we can find a way to continue the discussion. One last question for you from Annie. So basically, from your experiences, what best practices have you actually found to be effective in teaching such a humanities perspective, which is rooted in ambiguity, to colleagues or who are usually coming from STEM backgrounds?
Yeah. So the techniques that we use internally, a few things. We hold, like I said earlier, we are a small team. We are a 30-person team, and we support a 48,000 person organization. So in the grand scheme of things, we are a small team, right? So we love everyone to make this a part of their thinking, a part of their DNA, right? So which means some of the things that we are trying out internally is we have created this model of responsible AI champs. These are like champions within different core businesses at Microsoft who we partner with. We teach them a lot of best practices, and they can be the main point of contact in different organizations who can take some of our work forward. Whenever we finish major engagements, we try to publish best practices internally so that other teams can leverage and learn. Back to the humanities thing, whenever we do embedded sort of engagements with different product teams, so it's my job really to bring the perspectives of external people, and quotes and videos and stuff are really powerful, for those in the UX discipline, that. So I make it a point to have sessions with our product PMs and other engineers and sales counterparts, etc., to show them those quotes and those presentations. We have also created this technique called a community jury, and we piloted that with a certain project where we bring people who are impacted by the technology with product makers in the same room and have an open discussion and deliberate. So these are all powerful ways to bring that humanity perspective forward.
Thank you. That's amazing. I'm gonna do some of that in my small team. By the way, I have a team. We're 13. So when you said 30, but then you put it in context of 13,000. That's quite a feat. So thank you for that, and thank you all of you for Reed, for Matthew, and Arati for giving us your wonderful wisdom. Matthew, I saw that you posted as well some great links. So please check them out in the chat. Maybe we can do a follow up with some important links via email. And with that said, I'm going to pass it on to Todd, who's going to make some announcements coming next for the world of AI LA. And thank you all for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. I wish we could all do the clap, but not yet. But yeah, again, next week we do a show called The New Normal, which is a discussion forum, same time, 12 o'clock, where we do a 10-minute talk to 20 minutes with a breakout room discussions. And so I hope you'll be able to join us. Just go to joinai.la. You can learn more about our next show next week. And then we'll have a new programming coming up in July. And so I'll let you all get back to your rest of your days. And so thank you all, and be safe out there, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.